15 years ago, something terrible happened with my family. It took me years of therapy to recover from the shock. Many years have passed, but I still vividly remember that day. Some moments seem frozen in my memory, haunting me and keeping me awake at night. I want to forget it all, but I can't. My therapist suggested that I write everything down, saying it might help ease my memories. I'm not sure I believe her, but I'll try. I have no choice. I want to recover. I can't go on like this anymore. There are a couple of things you should know before I begin. First, my family distrusted technology. We didn't have a television, computer, phone, nothing. My father believed that such things rotted the mind and didn't hesitate to voice his opinion. Second, my family valued tranquility. Our house was on the hills, accessible only by a dirt road. We had no neighbors, no company. Just my mom, dad, my little brother Jay, and me. My mother homeschooled us while my father commuted to the city to work at the local bank. I can't say our family was unhappy. My mother, Lori, was caring and very kind to us, a faithful and submissive wife. My brother Jay was 2 years younger than me. I loved him dearly. He often misbehaved and rarely had to justify his actions to our parents. Our father, Henry, was strict but honest, a man of old-fashioned principles. He believed in morality, believed in setting an example to be followed, in being a true provider for our small family. That was until everything went downhill, until my father changed. It was breakfast time. I sat at the table, happily devouring my toast. My 6-year-old brother sat opposite me, loudly slurping his milk. Father entered the kitchen and asked Jay to behave, then kissed Mom on the cheek, wishing her a good morning. Mom smiled and helped Father tie his tie, informing him that lunch was packed and wishing him a good day. Father put on his sports jacket and picked up his briefcase from the kitchen counter. He tousled my hair lightly and leaned down to me. "Will you behave today, son?" he asked. I could smell his cologne and studied his cleanly shaven face. He was an attractive man, tall and broad-shouldered. I always looked up to him with respect. "Yes, Dad, I'll behave," I replied with a smile. Father approached my brother and asked him the same. Jay shrugged, smiling foolishly. One of his front teeth was loose and crooked. He often fiddled with it, but to no avail. "Maybe it'll finally fall out today," Father remarked, studying the stubborn tooth. He kissed Jay on the forehead and said goodbye to Mom, giving her an air kiss, then left the house. As I finished my toast, I heard him start the car and drive down the deserted road. Mom cleared the plates from the table, telling Jay and me to finish up and get ready for lessons. I hated studying, like all kids. To me, education seemed like a waste of time, filling me with boredom. The forests and hills were much more interesting than textbooks and pencils. With a lazy groan, I brushed the crumbs off my shirt and led Jay to our room to prepare for lessons. Now, I'll take a short pause. I'm feeling unwell at the thought of what happened that day. My psychiatrist thought it might help, but I'm not sure. I really don't want to think about it, let alone write it down. Maybe there's some merit in facing my fear head-on. Perhaps it'll be easier to come to terms with it. I won't try to delve into the psychology, but these memories are making me anxious. That morning was so good, so normal. Our house on the hill was surrounded by tranquility. We couldn't have imagined what awaited us, nor could we have known. The day went on as usual. Jay and I sat at the kitchen table, doing our lessons, much to Mom's relief. We tried not to die of boredom. For a snack, Mom made us peanut butter sandwiches and allowed us an hour to play. That was my favorite part of the school day. Jay and I wandered away from the house and into the woods. We climbed trees, skipped stones, and returned home. I remember how warm that day was. The June heat was just a precursor to the approaching July. Mom called us back to our studies. Time in the kitchen dragged on terribly slowly, but eventually, the clock hands formed a right angle, 3 o'clock, and we closed our textbooks. That evening, Jay and I folded paper airplanes on the living room floor while Mom prepared dinner. I remember the appetizing smell filling the house, the rustle of newspaper. Jay finished his first airplane and proudly held it above his head. At that moment, Father walked in. From the moment he crossed the threshold, I knew we were in for a restless night. We all know the tense atmosphere when a father is at odds with his emotions. But this time, it was different. There was an aura of unease around Father, unlike anything we'd ever experienced. He didn't say anything when he entered the house. He just tossed his coat over the back of a chair and set his briefcase on the floor. Mom turned away from the stove, smiled warmly, and greeted him affectionately, asking about his day. Father remained silent, then walked to the sink, filled a glass with water, downed it in one gulp, and turned to Jay. I noticed a shadow in his eyes.
"What are you doing?"
he asked sharply. "Look, Dad, it's a Boeing B-52 bomber," Jay proudly declared, soaring his airplane through the air. Unexpectedly, Father stepped forward, snatched the contraption from Jay's hands, and examined it with interest. He dropped the airplane and gave us a sharp look.
"Is this the newspaper I was reading this morning?"
I swallowed. Yes, Father was clearly not in a good mood.
"I allowed them to play with it. I thought you'd already read it."
Mom intervened. Father turned to her.
"Maybe next time you should ask me."
"Dear, I'm sorry. I didn't think it was that important to you."
Father fell silent again, pulled out a chair from the table, and sat down, never taking his eyes off us. I felt very uncomfortable. It seemed like he was trying to find justification for his anger, to come up with some reason. Usually, he didn't behave like this, although there were a few outbursts here and there. But by nature, he was a quiet and not at all cruel person.
"Bad day at the bank, honey?"
Mom sympathetically asked, stirring sauce in a pot. Father shot her a sharp look.
"It was the worst day of my life. Regarding over..."
He shook his head.
"You can't even imagine, none of you can, what I had to go through just to have food on this table."
Mom turned to him with a sad expression.
"Oh God, I'm so sorry to hear that. Do you want a beer, dear?"
He nodded. Mom walked over to the fridge, took out a cold bottle, and handed it to Father, placing her hand on his shoulder. Father tried to unscrew the cap.
"First, bam it. It won't twist."
He cut his palm on the cap, and drops of blood appeared. I started thinking about an escape plan from the kitchen.
"Careful, dear. I'll get a towel."
Mom tried to ease the tension.
"Don't bother."
He forcefully slammed the bottle on the table, and the neck shattered into pieces. Father poured the remaining beer into a glass and then threw the bottle towards the trash can, missing it. Shards scattered across the floor.
"Calm down, Henry."
Mom said calmly. Father took a sip, then placed the glass on the table with a loud thud.
"Maybe next time you'll hand me that damn towel right away. Or are you so dumb that you need constant reminders?"
Mom didn't want an argument. She silently turned away and continued cooking. Father took another sip from the glass and gave Jay and me a hostile look. I looked at my paper airplane and absent-mindedly twirled it in my hands. Right now, I wish my father would forget about my existence for a while.
"Tommy."
He called me. My heart stopped. I looked at him fearfully.
"Have you been good today?"
Father asked.
"Tommy, have you been a good boy today?"
There was a hint of mockery in his voice. He drilled me with his gaze. I nodded. Father finished his beer without taking his eyes off me, then placed the glass down and muttered,
"Pray it stays that way."
While my brother and I tried to blend into the floor, Father got up and walked to the bedroom to change into his home clothes. I breathed a sigh of relief and looked at Jay. He made a face, his tooth still protruding from under his upper lip. "Behave," I whispered. I picked up my airplane, deciding to take it to my room. I didn't want my father to start a scene. I needed to get away from his gaze. Then he might forget about me. Passing by my parents' bedroom, I peeked inside and saw Father. He stood shirtless facing the wall, not moving. He just stood there, eyes closed, hands against the wall with elbows out. He didn't move at all, just stood in silence like a statue. I didn't understand what it meant. His strange pose scared me, and I ran to my room. As soon as I hid my airplane in the wardrobe, Mom called everyone to dinner. She placed a large dish of spaghetti on the table, emitting a wonderful aroma of garlic and basil. Jay rubbed his stomach and made a dramatic face to show Mom how hungry he was. Father entered the kitchen without a word and sat at the table opposite Mom, who gave him a cautious look. Father clasped his hands and turned to me.
Tommy, can you say grace for us tonight?
I nodded and closed my eyes, folding my hands together. Oh, Christ, thank you. I slightly jumped as Father slammed his fist on the table. Jay let out a quiet yelp and Mom flinched. Father leaned towards me.
Tommy, do you really think Jesus will hear you when you speak so softly? Over, but louder.
My heart pounded wildly, and I had to muster a lot of effort to control the tremble in my voice. Such a burst of anger was not characteristic of my father. I didn't know how to react to this. Lowering my gaze, I started again. Oh, Christ, thank you for the food and for Mom who cooked it. After a short pause, I added, and thank you for Dad, who provided us with this food. Amen. Mom echoed my amen and praised me for the good prayer. Jay stared at Dad expectantly. Dad glanced at the spaghetti bowl and clenched his jaw.
Again, Laura, I understand you can't cook anything besides pasta. It's not your fault. Apparently, your parents just weren't wealthy enough to send you to college and make something out of you.
Mom looked at him. She was taken back. Dad met her gaze, his face stone cold. He wanted to provoke her, get some kind of response out of her, but Mom wisely avoided eye contact and began twirling spaghetti onto her fork. Jay eagerly dug into the food, slurping noodles with gusto. It was accompanied by loud smacking and sauce plattering from his mouth. I watched in horror at Dad's reaction. He turned to my brother.
Jay, what did I tell you about table manners?
Jay froze with the fork halfway to his mouth. Dad pointed at him.
Mean to me right now.
My heart sank. I took deep breaths, genuinely worried for my brother. He trembled in fear as he got up from the chair.
Give me your plate,
Dad demanded. Jay took the plate and slowly approached Dad. Dad gave him a disapproving look, shook his head.
I didn't raise you to be a pig.
Dad grimly said, then abruptly snatched the plate from Jay's hands and hurled it to the floor, causing spaghetti to scatter all over the kitchen. I jumped in surprise again, then sank into the chair, wishing to become invisible. Mom's mouth open. Dad pointed at the floor.
Come on, son. If you want to act like a filthy animal, then you should eat like one on the floor.
Jay looked at Mom, and I noticed he was on the verge of tears. He didn't understand what to do, from whom to expect help.
Henry, don't you think this is going too far?
Mom intervened. Dad slammed his hands on the table again and raised his voice.
Lori, if you don't raise the children properly, then...
He stopped mid-sentence. We froze. Mom remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Jay quietly whimpered next to me. I took his hand and squeezed it gently. Dad blinked, and one of his eyes rolled inward, then returned to its normal position. It happened so quickly, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. He coughed and shook his head, blinked a few more times, looked at Jay and me, saw me holding Jay's hand, tears welling in his eyes.
Tommy, let go of your brother,
he demanded, his eye twitching slightly. I obeyed, and our sweaty palms parted. I looked at Dad. The appetite had long disappeared. My mouth felt dry, and I was uncomfortable. I didn't understand why he was acting this way towards us. Why he had never been so cruel to what happened that day. Looking straight at me, Dad gestured for Jay to return to his seat.
Tommy, I was disciplining your brother. Guys, do you know why I scold you so you can tell right from wrong? Now, you try to comfort Jay.
He leaned towards me, his breath hot.
Does that mean you're on his side? Do you also think it's okay to behave like pigs at my table?
I shook my head in fear. No, Dad cut me off, holding his hand up.
Quiet. I don't want to punish you for lying on top of everything else. Put your hands here.
He slapped the table. I glanced at Mom with a plea. Her face was pale. She didn't know how to react. Her husband had never been like this, and she didn't want to say anything, fearing to anger him even more.
On the table, I said.
He repeated more insistently. I placed my trembling hand palm down on the table. Jay started crying. Dad raised a fork in front of him.
Henry?
Mom whispered, her eyes wide with surprise. I looked at Dad, holding back tears, trembling with fear. With the fork in hand, Dad began.
It's time for you to understand that.
He suddenly stopped, started coughing heavily, dropped the fork on the table. His mouth wide open, his tongue seemed to coil around his chin. One of his eyes began to twitch rapidly, and Dad struggled to rub it, shutting his mouth and baring his teeth. We are all sat there, afraid to move, shocked by this horrifying sight. Dad clearly wasn't himself. After a couple of seconds, he withdrew his hand from his face and smiled broadly.
All right, guys, I think you've learned your lesson. Remember my words and don't do this again, okay?
Jay and I hurriedly nodded, wishing desperately to get out of the kitchen as soon as possible. I felt as if I were trapped in a parallel reality, in a blood-chilling nightmare from which I needed to wake up.
Tommy, could you tidy up, please? Be a dear,
he asked. I obeyed, but his attention had already shifted to Mom. He glanced at her several times from head to toe, nervously twirling his fork, and his gaze was rather strange, as if he were appraising Mom, scrutinizing every inch of her body. Meanwhile, I was scraping spaghetti remnants off the floor when Dad addressed Jay.
Bring me a brick from outside.
I heard Jay leave the house through the black entrance, the door echoing a familiar squeak.
Henry, what's going on?
Mom murmured. I was occupied with cleaning, but I sensed fear in her voice. Dad didn't reply, and I finished wiping the sauce off the floor when Jay returned, holding a brick smeared with dirt. He placed it on the table in front of Dad. Dad turned to us with a cold tone.
Well, go to your room and go to bed now. I'll be fuck your mother.
Mom gasped in fear. I took Jay's hand, my heart pounding wildly. Dad rarely cursed, and never in such a twisted manner. We quickly walked to our room. Jay's face was wet with tears and snot, his eyes huge with fear and confusion. He didn't understand why his own father treated him like this, and neither did I. I squeezed his little hand. We closed the bedroom door and looked at each other. Dad's loud cursing could be heard from the kitchen. Jay covered his ears and ran to the bed, burying his face in the pillow. I approached him and placed my hand on his back. Jay sobbed, his sobs only slightly muffled by the pillow. Then I heard Mom scream. Tears flowed involuntarily. The air burned in my lungs. I closed my eyes and covered my ears. Immediately, I heard something fall on the kitchen floor, followed by rhythmic beats. Mom screamed horribly, inhumanly. I wanted it all to stop, but she screamed incessantly, again and again. Jay wasn't just crying. He was wailing, trying not to hear what was happening in the kitchen. His entire body was trembling, and it seemed to me that he was struggling to breathe. I rushed to the bed next to him and hugged him. I was crying too, and didn't know what to do. I just wanted this nightmare to end quickly. Then came the sound of glass shattering in the kitchen, followed by Mom's screams and the scraping of chair legs being dragged across the wooden floor. Jay prayed with a trembling voice. My body felt like jelly, my muscles weak and unresponsive. I had never experienced such terror in my life. Finally, Mom's screams ceased and the house fell silent. I could hear nothing but the pulsating blood in my ears. Jay was no longer sobbing. He was quietly whimpering, still burying his face in the pillow. I looked at the closed bedroom door and fervently wished it would remain that way. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, stopping behind the wall. In the parents' room, there was some commotion, and then the door to their room closed. I waited. Jay sat up on the bed, and I told him not to make a sound as I wiped the tears from his face, continuing to hold him in my arms. The footsteps were slow again. I was sure that Mom was dead. After such screams, people usually don't survive. The bedroom door swung open. Jay screamed and clung to me even tighter. Dad entered the room, or rather crawled on all fours. His lower jaw hung freely, his mouth wide open, dripping some liquid from his chin. His eyes were rolled back so that his pupils were not visible. He walked around the room, opening and closing his mouth and spitting saliva. He blinked rapidly. One of his eyes turned towards us. He coughed several times, spitting out thick saliva, then wiped his lips and stood up, looking at us again. We sat huddled together on the bed, not moving.
Follow me.
The air wheezed out of his chest. I didn't move. Jay still clung to me. I could feel the trembling of his body, how he was drenched in cold sweat. Dad stepped toward us.
Both of you, get up now.
Where's Mom? I asked, my voice trembling again. He stood in front of us.
She's resting. It was a tough day for her, and now get up.
Jay broke away from me and obediently shuffled to the door. I had no choice, so I followed suit. Dad put his hands on our shoulders and led us through the house. I listened intently to the surrounding silence, hoping to hear Mom. What had he done to her? Where was she? Was her lifeless body lying in the bedroom? I couldn't hear anything. We reached the kitchen. The dining table was pushed close to the kitchen cabinets. Glass shards were scattered on the floor. I expected to see blood, but there was none until I saw the brick. It lay next to the sink. Half of it was vividly red, fresh blood dripping from it. All my muscles seemed to have turned to stone. Dad seemed to notice, and his hand pressed harder on my shoulder. Jay was breathing anxiously, not daring to lift his eyes, afraid to see what Dad might have done to Mom. We found ourselves outside. The night air was humid. A huge yellow moon hung in the sky, like a Christmas ornament out of place and time. Stars blinked in the night sky, and the chirping of crickets could be heard. Everything here was different from the house. Everything seemed alive and pulsated in unison with the heartbeat of the night. Meanwhile, we circled the house and approached our old shed. Dad didn't keep much there, just tools and a lawnmower that he hardly ever used. I never liked that shed. It scared me for some reason. At night, I imagined some horrible creature crawling out of it and creeping into my room through the window. We stopped, and Dad lightly pushed our shoulders.
Wait here.
His voice seemed unnatural. I looked at his face and saw him rolling his eyes again. I want to go home, to Mom. Jay whimpered, wiping his nose with the back of his hand.
You'll go home when you're ready and let go,
Dad said, breaking the sentence into two absolutely meaningless parts. He coughed heavily and stuck out his tongue, then stumbled and almost fell. It seemed like he was choking, but soon he regained control of his body, shaking his head vigorously enough to make his teeth clack together. He entered the shed, glancing back at us. Jay stared at me, petrified, waiting for some logical explanation from me about the madness happening around us, but I couldn't string two words together in my head to calm my brother. "What will he do to us?" he whispered. The warm moonlight reflected in his eyes. "Everything will be okay." I tried to reassure him, but these words were outright lies. We couldn't see what Dad was doing in the shed because the door was closed. The summer wind rustled the tops of distant trees, and the rustling of leaves could be heard. At that moment, I prayed for the wind to carry us away with it. Jay and I stood still. We didn't know what would be worse, experiencing what Dad intended to do with us or running away and subsequently experiencing his hellish wrath. And there was nowhere for us to run. To whom? Our childish minds were like on a leash. We depended too much on our parents. We were still too helpless. The shed door opened, snapping me out of my thoughts. Dad stepped out into the night. His figure seemed like a shadow.
"Come inside, both of you,"
he demanded. Jay grabbed my hand, and we walked in. Dad stepped aside and let us pass. The smell of decaying wood and dampness hit my nose, and I immediately started rubbing it instinctively to get rid of the stench. Dad illuminated the cramped shed by turning on an old electric lantern, and its light reflected off the small lawnmower standing on the workbench to our right. Around the lantern itself lay old tools, rusty hammers, screwdrivers, pliers. I wasn't sure if Dad had ever used them, but all this I saw out of the corner of my eye because I was focused on something else. I couldn't tear my gaze away. Jay painfully dug his nails into my hand when he saw it too. His breathing quickened. From a crossbeam under the ceiling hung a noose. The rope was tied in a tight knot and thrown over the beam. Nearby hung the free end of the rope, looking extremely ominous. Dad came up behind us and closed the door. He stood near the noose and pointed at it.
Come on, Tommy, let's finish this.
Dad, my voice was dry as tinder. What are you going to do? My heart raced, feeling like it was pounding against my ribs, tight in my chest. Dad ran his finger along the dangling noose.
You'll be my weather vane. I need to know when the wind blows north. You'll make a good wind chime when I gut you, but those I'll take care of later.
Daddy, why are you doing this to us? Jay cried, tears rolling down his cheeks. There was no answer. He just waited for me to come to him, and I didn't move. What if he meant it? It couldn't be true. He was my dad. He always loved me. Memories of all the love and kindness my dad had shown me throughout my, albeit short, life flooded my mind. I believed him. He was my father. But the dark spark in his eyes genuinely scared me. Reality and memories clashed in my mind and panic set in. Dad grasped the noose with his hand.
If you don't come right now, then I'll take Jay instead of you.
But my brother clung to me, his face buried in my chest, crying out repeatedly, "No, no, no, no." I felt my shirt soak with his tears. I hugged him tightly, feeling his wet hair against my cheek. I heard my own heart, and my lips dried and cracked. Breathing became difficult. Dad, I began to cry, Dad. I don't want this. Please don't. Cold sweat ran down my face. Suddenly, Dad grabbed me, twisted my arm, and dragged me toward the noose. I screamed and tried to push him away, which of course didn't work. He pushed me, trying to position me conveniently under the rope. It cast a shadow resembling a dark halo over my head. Jay screamed at the top of his lungs. His face turned red and contorted in animalistic fear. He was simply unable to do anything. Meanwhile, my dad lowered the noose and put it around my neck. My dad was going to hang me. The mere thought of it was like a blade piercing my heart. I trembled in anticipation of the inevitable. The rope unpleasantly rubbed against my neck. It was really happening before that moment. I couldn't even think that my own father was capable of such a thing, especially toward his own son. He was my hero and always ready to come to the rescue for my brother and me, and at that moment I trembled in anticipation of death at his hands.
That's it,
said Dad standing behind me, grabbing the free end of the rope hanging from the ceiling. I heard the rope begin to tighten, and suddenly my throat was engulfed in flames. The burning fire pressed against my lower jaw. My legs lifted off the ground, and I began to kick them helplessly, scratching my neck with my hands. I couldn't slip a single finger between the rope and my skin. It pressed so tightly against my neck that it was impossible to push a fingertip under. My head felt swollen, and blood seemed ready to burst out of my eyes and mouth. I coughed frantically and felt terrible spasms when trying to inhale. The colors started to blur in my eyes, and I felt death. Suddenly, the pain stopped, and the fiery ring stopped squeezing my throat. I fell painfully to my knees and pressed against them, bending over. I gasped for air in large gulps. Oxygen had never seemed so sweet to me. The world began to take shape again, and I heard Dad's desperate scream. Blinking, I pushed the dark spots out of my eyes. Dad leaned against the wall and howled in pain, clutching his arm. Blood poured abundantly through his shirt. Jay stood nearby, crying. His right hand was elbow-deep in blood. In his hand, he held a rusty office knife, the blade of which dripped with... "Don't touch Tommy," Jay yelled. "Don't touch him, Dad." Clutching the wound with one hand, Dad tried to snatch the knife from Jay's hand, but he immediately recoiled, almost stumbling.
"Look what you've done."
Dad removed his hand, revealing a deep cut. His shirt was soaked with blood, making it completely red in some places. I got up and pulled Jay towards me, took the office knife from him, and grabbed my head. It was splitting. "I'm okay, everything's fine," I said, trying to reassure Jay. Suddenly, Dad lunged at me, pushing himself off the wall with his back. Without hesitation, I swung the knife at him. A reflex, it seemed like time slowed down when the knife entered my father's hand. It slid through the flesh as if through butter, smoothly cutting Dad's wrists, like lightning on a jacket. Blood splattered into my eyes. Dad screamed in agony, withdrew his hand, and pressed it to himself. He fell to the floor, and his face still burned with anger, but noticeably paled. He breathed heavily, and it was clear that he would soon come to his senses and attack us again. I grabbed Jay, and we ran out of the shed. Behind our backs, we heard a furious howl. The fresh air hit my face, and I saw several trucks pulling up the hill on the dirt road. They were huge and noisy, their diesel engines growling ominously at us. The white headlights illuminated my blood-stained face. Some people, first 2, then 3, and then 4 unknown men, approached our house and stopped. They were in uniform. Even at such a young age, I recognized military camouflage. What's happening? I asked myself. I hugged Jay to me, and we moved towards the soldiers. I didn't understand what they were doing here, but one thing was clear. We desperately needed help. 2 men in hazmat suits came out of the white van unexpectedly and rushed towards us, shouting and waving their arms, scaring both of us half to death. My brother trembled behind me, and several more uniformed people got out of the van, and they all wore gas masks, which made them even more intimidating in the moonlight. 2 in hazmat suits began to approach us slowly. When they came almost close, I took a step back and clenched the fist holding the knife. I didn't care who these people were or why they were aiming weapons at us. I only wanted to protect Jay. He had been through enough. We both had.
It's okay, kid. Everything's okay.
One of the strangers in the hazmat suit raised his hands, while the other held a gun, scanning our yard.
Where is he?
One with the gun asked. I remained silent in fear and confusion.
Where's your father, kid?
The other clarified. Through the mask of the suit, his blue eyes were visible. He's over there, Jay exclaimed. He was going to hurt Tommy, and I had to cut him. I didn't want Tommy to die. The 2 in hazmat suits glanced at each other, and the first one nodded to the second. We watched as he crept up to the shed and peeked inside. He turned around, waved in our direction, and gave a thumbs up to the people in gas masks. He entered the shed and killed my father. A deafening gunshot marked the end of his life. I flinched, standing in shock, in blood, still frightened, not understanding who these people were, what they were doing at our house, and why they had killed my father. I pulled Jay closer to me. He looked at me with huge, bewildered eyes. He killed Dad. Jay's voice trembled. One of the men in the hazmat suit shook his head.
Son, you have nothing more to worry about. Now everything will be okay. He won't hurt you anymore.
Someone shouted at him from behind, and I slightly leaned aside to look. The soldiers in gas masks had already entered the house. One of them waved his hand, calling for a doctor. Mom. I prayed that she would be okay, that these people could help. I didn't know what my father had done to her, but I remembered how piercing her scream had been. What's happening? I whispered, watching as the man with the gun came out of the shed. He loudly asked something to the other soldiers, but I didn't understand his words. The world seemed to be crumbling around me. Shock was creeping up on me. The soldier knelt down and reassuringly placed his hands on our shoulders.
Guys, I'm not the one who should be telling you this, especially not at this moment,
he said. I looked at him, tears welling up in my eyes again. I had just been nearly hanged by my own father. I couldn't take any more. His eyes widened behind the mask, and he glanced at my brother and me with a fleeting look of uncertainty. Come on, please, I began to plead. I wanted to find some semblance of sense in the chaos unfolding around us. He sighed.
Guys, something terrible happened today. It's not my place to tell you, but...
He trailed off, then looked at us again.
At the bank where your father worked, there was an accident, like an earthquake. A deep fissure opened in the earth, releasing some gas that the wind carried into the city.
He shook his head and lowered his gaze.
It killed many people. We're trying to contain it, whatever it is, and prevent it from spreading.
So you shot my dad because he got hit by bad wind? Jay asked quietly, sniffling and rubbing his nose. The soldier looked at our faces, frightened.
Your father died this morning along with all the bank employees. His body has been in our lab for a while now, and an autopsy is being performed as we speak. Damn, I'm so sorry.
His words cut through me like a razor blade. I sank into deep thought, trying to connect the tumultuous stream of thoughts into coherence. What was he talking about? Dad died this morning, but that's impossible. He came home from work like any other day, and now his body lay in the shed. This man was lying to me. There's no other explanation. Then who is in there? I forced out with effort. He shook his head.
And whatever is in that shed, it's not your father. Actually, something else crawled out of that fissure besides the deadly gas. It took on the appearance of your father and came to your house. Witnesses saw your father emerge from the rubble. He was the only survivor. When we found the real body of your father, we didn't believe it at first. Guys, I didn't want to tell you this. I'm so sorry. Truly sorry. Don't stand here for long. We need to take you to the hospital. Everything will be okay, I promise.
Jay and I headed towards the cars. I saw the soldiers carrying Mom out of the house. She was alive, barely conscious. Seeing us, she reached out her hand and called out to us. Jay burst into tears and rushed to her. I wanted to do the same, but I was too drained. My brain was still trying to process the information. There was no sense in any of this. It couldn't be true. It just couldn't. How could life turn upside down in one night? What awaited us now? Where were they taking us? Would everything be okay? I had no idea. I felt a touch on my hand and noticed one of the soldiers trying to retrieve the stationary knife from it. I didn't resist, and the bloodied steel slowly slipped out of my grip, reflecting on that night. I watched as the people in hazmat suits pulled my father's body out of the shed and packed it into a body bag. There was only one thought in my head. What was that creature?